4 Slam Master Evenings. Ah, 'tis good to speak to a fine scholar, said the mild-mannered druggist. The little shop was cluttered with all manner of bombs. Among them, Barry had grabbed a small pack of fine herbal lozenges, a courtesy purchase. His real quarry was knowledge. I be not so up to snuff as likes ta. But, from recollection, th finest spore sta be found deeper south, in the earth of dank woods. 'Tis fortune yeb's going that way. Barry thanked the good man for his time, and purchasing the lozenges, popped one in his mouth as he left the store, not so much to soothe the passages of his throat, as those of his brain. He wouldn't hold up the trip by spending too long schroomsearching. But this could be a rare opportunity. The alchemical apparatuses he'd stowed would suffice for some probing experiments. He took his leave. As he walked out the door, he spotted some lanky clown with a stupid hat and a sheriff badge sidling down the dirt road towards him. He pretended not to notice. "Greetings, citizen," the bull-egged lawman said as he neared. "I hear the boss of the newcomers is a man answering to your description. Don't take long for word to spread around these parts." Barry gave him a vacant glance, frowning with thought. "Carry on about your lawful business," the man continued, "but just one quick thing. We been getting reports of felonious dog-faced men in the area. You may want to be on your guard." "Felonious? Have they been accused of anything specific?" "Well," the sheriff rubbed the back of his neck. "And rubbed. He rubbed and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed." Then he looked up. But Barry was long gone. The saloon's facade was even gaudier up close. Bas-reliefs of impish jesters, sagging harlots and black cats stood out in sycamore and tinsel. He put his hand against the swinging doors. Time to scope out the action. The big dance hall was smoky. A jukebox somewhere blared old-time rock and roll music. At a glance, he could see that most of the boys were already inside. There was a fair variety of different travelers, for such a small outpost. A waitstaffer went up to him. He ordered avocado toast and ginseng tea, then stepped through the smoke towards a dark corner. A group of dog-faced youths lounged against any available surface. At their center was a table. Its surface was cluttered with beer bottles, cigars, revolvers, ammunition, candy bar wrappers, and tarot cards. One dog-faced man sat at the table. Portly, wearing a grimy dinner vest and rainbow suspenders, his abundant beard and mustache marked him as the patriarch. On his high, creased forehead, Barry noted, not a drop of sweat glistened. "Sit, partner," the man said. Barry sat in the only available chair, directly opposite the imposing man. After looking Barry over for a moment, a look which was returned in like measure, he began to shuffle the cards. His pudgy hands manipulated the deck with expert dexterity. All this strange patriarch's movements had a languid quality that served to enhance the aura of authority. Suddenly, he fanned the deck and proffered it across the table, leaning his bulk over it like a portentous storm cloud. "Care to pick a card, pal?" "I dare say." Unhesitating, Barry reached out and, swiftly but courteously, lay a card in the exact center of the table. Gasps came from the group. It was the Upright Tower, card 16 of the Major Arcana. The big man cocked an eyebrow. "Mighty ominous. Been a while since I've seen that card, but maybe it's about time, eh? I forgot to introduce myself. Phil, at your service." Barry knew that Phil, to his credit, was not at anyone's service. "And these young bucks is my posse. We go by the handle of Dog Boys. Everyone knows us round here. You might have met a lawman. We try to be good neighbors. Truth is, we was rustlin' up legitimate business when he came at us like a hungry lawyer. We don't have no quarrel with the law. But what we do exactly, is our business. And business is good. Maybe you can get in on it sometime, if you're a good neighbor like we are. I hear you dabble in mushrooms. But that's just the gossips. Maybe. And if you dog boys turn out to really be good neighbors, I may let you in on what I've got my fingers in, which, as you so nicely put it, is my business. And I think business might very soon be better than anyone would imagine. Boys, we're heading into a bold and mighty new era. To paraphrase the poet, it should be an age undreamed of. Barry arose and moved off into the smoke. The waitstaff came by with his tray. He ate the avocado toast in 2 bites, then bolted the ginseng tea in 1 gulp, and kept moving. He was searching along the back wall. Nobody dared disturb this odd, rangy stranger. The music had changed to thumping techno. A bookcase was situated conspicuously in a seemingly random spot along the wall's length. This was a saloon, not a coffee shop. The shelves were sparsely occupied with alchemical curios, such as a unicorn skull and several megatama. Curious. He doubted they were authentic, but if they were, this would be a collection of immense value. And for it to be sitting here where any drunken lout could get to it? Or could they? He muttered, focused his third eye into a quick oral scan. As he suspected, there was an obscuring aura to distract the minds of the uninitiated. But it wasn't strong enough to delay him even slightly. The low strength couldn't be explained by lack of skill alone. Whoever had put this up had been very hurried, very distracted, or had little interest in the effectiveness, or perhaps all three. He twisted on a black ram horn. From off to the right came a dry creaking. A trapdoor. Of course. He looked around. No one had seemed to notice. What was the idea? Was he walking right into a trap? His scholarly heart burned. He stepped through the door. Immediately his nostrils were assailed by a rank blast of tobacco and cannabis, a full-body jolt that nearly knocked him clean over. The gambling den must have been larger than the saloon and the inn combined. Nearly every cushion was taken up by a group of men fervently and noisily engaged in a game of chance. Dice and dominoes seemed to predominate, but craps and roulette wheels were very much in evidence. Everywhere, sagging pro strumpets hung onto their male counterparts. Barry was nauseated by the odor of sexism. "Hey yi," he yelled out to all the clinging whores and smoking chumps. "Don't you see that there are no female patrons, no male prostitutes? What you're all promulgating with your dirty little games here is harmful, and you're the primary victims." A lot of patrons turned curiously. Soon, everyone was back to their games. They were entranced by the ordered chaos they had herded themselves into. Barry stepped farther into this realm of 1,000 abysses, where time was not surpassed, but merely murdered. He scanned to ensure that none of his boys were caught up in the tomfoolery. The more he saw, the more it all disgusted him. Vile, pock swine gulped whiskey and choked on fumes from the finest indica strains. Barry used his aura scan. He was right in his suspicion the cigars were laced with opium. It was a fink party. Suddenly, scans brought trouble signs. It was the cop. His dumb, floppy hat was creeping over from the podium where he'd been preaching something. Barry braced his muscles for action, hot-coiled springs aching against chance. "Well, howdy again." The sheriff now sneered openly. "Isn't it past your bedtime? Maybe we should just run along, beanpole. Nobody making trouble for my most valued patrons." His breath stank of gin, stank like a dog. "In your current condition, partner," Barry said, "I can easily dispatch you. Move along and forget this encounter." The sheriff chuckled grimly. "Well, how about I just not fight you then?" He whistled. Down from the rafters sailed a humanoid seemingly crafted from filth, hair, and muscle. The apparition had 6-inch talons for fingernails, and beady, red eyes. It was clad in a filthy blue uniform with a filthy, tattered blue hat. It could only have been slightly smaller than Torval had been, and its muscles were even more defined. It spat a greasy wad of phlegm near Barry's feet, and raising its head into the air, let out a mordant yelp. It looked sidelong at Barry and stuck out its tongue. It spun itself around and whooped, passing gas that smelled horridly of expired radishes. And it shot a booger straight from its hairy left nostril, landing squarely atop the phlegm it had spat, with pinpoint precision. "This is my sheriff's deputy," the sheriff said. Then it was go time. The crowd had gathered with perfect instinct. Betting began. The bookkeepers scrambled to keep up. Before everyone could place their bets, the fight was already heating up. The deputy was using its claws to prevent Barry from moving into its zone. There had to be a good way to neutralize those things. A saggy, greasy patron was eating a noodle bowl nearby. Without taking his eyes off the deputy for a second, Barry reached an arm out. He was surprised. The elasticity of his reach almost made him overshoot his target, the chopsticks. He brought them back and ducked right in time to dodge a lunging strike at his neck. What happened next was poetry in motion. In a tense dance-off, Barry began on each of the fingernails, snapping them of one by one and flinging them into the crowd. One landed plop in the sheriff's drink. Another stuck itself atop the bun in a prostitute's hair. The sheriff got another drink. A fingernail bisected his maraschino cherry. "I popped your cherry, bitch," Barry called out. A fingernail struck a die and revealed the weight inside it, then two more nails did the same for two other dice. Liquor bottles all along the bar began to leak fluid as they were stuck by fingernail talons. The whole time, Barry never took his eyes off the deputy, deftly dodging every attack. At last, there were no nails left on its grotesque paws. Stragglers desperately tried to place bets on the mysterious stranger, but all betting was off. The deputy began to piss. That shithead really pissed himself. It was coming down like Niagara. It turned around to run, but Barry was quick on its trail. He grabbed by the scruff of the neck and pulled. The deputy scampered. Barry dragged it up against a chair. Leaning down, he fiddled around with his grip on the barely conscious, piss-stinking deputy. Apparition had 6-inch talons for fingernails, and beady, red eyes. It was clad in a filthy blue uniform with a filthy, tattered blue hat. It could only have been slightly smaller than Torval had been, and its muscles were even more defined. It spat a greasy wad of phlegm near Barry's feet, and raising its head into the air, let out a mordant yelp. It looked sidelong at Barry and stuck out its tongue. It spun itself around and whooped, passing gas that smelled horridly of expired radishes. And it shot a booger straight from its hairy left nostril, landing squarely atop the phlegm it had spat, with pinpoint precision. "This is my sheriff's deputy," the sheriff said. Then it was go time. The crowd had gathered with perfect instinct. Betting began. The bookkeepers scrambled to keep up. Before everyone could place their bets, the fight was already heating up. The deputy was using its claws to prevent Barry from moving into its zone. There had to be a good way to neutralize those things. A saggy, greasy patron was eating a noodle bowl nearby. Without taking his eyes off the deputy for a second, Barry reached an arm out. He was surprised. The elasticity of his reach almost made him overshoot his target, the chopsticks. He brought them back and ducked right in time to dodge a lunging strike at his neck. What happened next was poetry in motion. In a tense dance-off, Barry began on each of the fingernails, snapping them of one by one and flinging them into the crowd. One landed plop in the sheriff's drink. Another stuck itself atop the bun in a prostitute's hair. The sheriff got another drink. A fingernail bisected his maraschino cherry. "I popped your cherry, bitch," Barry called out. A fingernail struck a die and revealed the weight inside it, then two more nails did the same for two other dice. Liquor bottles all along the bar began to leak fluid as they were stuck by fingernail talons. The whole time, Barry never took his eyes off the deputy, deftly dodging every attack. At last, there were no nails left on its grotesque paws. Stragglers desperately tried to place bets on the mysterious stranger, but all betting was off. The deputy began to piss, I mean that shithead really pissed himself. It was coming down like Niagara. It turned around to run, but Barry was quick on its trail. He grabbed by the scruff of the neck and pulled. The deputy scampered. Barry dragged it up against a chair. Leaning down, he fiddled around with his grip on the barely conscious, piss-stinking deputy. From the crowd, a prescient observer yelled, "Ah, Barry lifted the hairy, damp creature into the air feet first. The crowd boggled. The deputy should have been perfectly limp, yet its feet stuck into the air like flagpoles. The sheriff cursed through gritted teeth. He'd seen the setup. It was the dreaded vertical suplex. Walking around in a slight circle, Barry took his time securing his position, hoisting his opponent's upside-down shoulder firmly up onto his own, getting a good grip on his belt, while making very sure there was no fluid discharge left in the groin to drip down. He began leaning over backwards, off the chair, taking the deputy with him, maintaining posture. Then he slammed. The gambling hall rocked. In the druggist's, the old man was dusting his shelves before turning in. He started. The store clinked as his goods gave a little hop, and everything rattled slightly. In the dry goods store, barrels full of corn kernels suddenly exploded, popcorn nebulas blasting all over the place. In the post office, the mailboy was working overtime to keep up with the backlog. His stacks got completely shuffled, undoing a night's work. In the outhouse, an old drunk's constitutional seemed to want to hop back up his bottom. He looked at the bottle in his hand. I gotta give this stuff up. And in the saloon, the barkeep was shaking a mixed drink to the rhythm of the music. Suddenly, a record scratch happened and the fluid flew straight up his nose, making him go cross-eyed like a silent film funny man. Oh snap! The crowd was roaring. Barry took note of the sheriff's position trapped in a corner among cheering patrons. He still couldn't bolt without being conspicuous. But if Barry was any judge, it wasn't this clown's style to bolt. He would try to find some new way to exert pressure. Barry looked down at the bedraggled deputy. Now was the time to get practice in. None of the T-Town boys seemed to have found a location. At least, there were none visible in the crowd. Leaning over, he picked the deputy up bodily, still very careful to avoid any potential urine spots. The crowd's frenzy was unabated. The harlots, he realized, were now just as entranced and excited as the chumps. If it could equalize a crowd, maybe there was something to this wrestling stuff after all. Getting a carefully balanced hold on the deputy, whose legs were once again standing up miraculously straight like lightning rods in spite of its being upside down and virtually unconscious, Barry walked over to a tall stool, and gingerly stepped onto it 1 foot at a time, bringing himself up to standing position. He started to lean back. Oh! Barry slammed again. In the outhouse, the old drunk's urine jumped back up and landed neatly in his flask. Well, that's enough incentive for me, he said, tipping the flask into the hole and stepping out. In the saloon, everyone at the bar looked wistfully into their drinks, like ducks in a row. Then, starting at one end and moving down to the other, the fluid in each glass flew up into their nostrils, making them, in sequence, go comically cross-eyed in a perfect facsimile of the barkeep. In the post office, the mailboy was stoically contemplating a loaded revolver. Suddenly, all the mail sorted itself into perfect piles, hours of work saved from his original investment. Humming a happy tune to himself, he went out to see what was happening at the saloon. In the dry goods store, which was a sea of popcorn, all the oil, butter, and salt packages on the shelves, and some of the sugar and pepper, exploded at once and got all over the place. In the druggist's, just as he was about to lock up, the store gave another small clink. Shrugging, he headed home for the evening. And in the gambling den, it was pandemonium. Ah shit son. The crowd was at risk of stampeding Barry. Witchcraft, cried the now ineffectual sheriff. This was outside of his range of experience. "My dear lawman," smiled Barry. "I'll take you and your lackey on any time." And with that, he got geared up for the grand finale, and picked the pathetic legal beagle up by the back of his underwear. Many spectators had to back off and sit down to give their pulses a break. Barry had thought it couldn't get any louder. Now the people were literally screaming. He got the vertical suplex grip on the sheriff, making sure his shoulder rested comfortably on Barry's. "Why can't I move my legs?" the weakling cried as his body assumed the mystical vertical suplex position, stricken by a paralysis that defied gravity. Barry easily carried his payload towards the gambling den's bar counter. On the far end from the entrance, there was a massive spittoon, the size of a bath tube. The crowd kept screaming. Barry began positioning the spittoon with his feet. He would need a thoroughgoing understanding of fluid displacement to avoid doing himself or anyone in the crowd a disservice. He shuffled the vessel to the proper spot, made a last angle calculation. The crowd kept screaming. This was the training he needed. He got a really good, firm grip on the lawboy's sheriff's star belt buckle. His dumb little boots stuck in the air like the stalks of a deformed vegetable. "This can't be happening to me. This is not happening to me. I get to be the sheriff. Someone help." Barry stepped carefully up onto the counter, his praise boots grazing a light fixture, which wobbled in tense expectation. A third time, he slammed. For the split second it all happened, there was sudden and total silence. He dropped down like before, back first. But this time he released his grip at the exact time and place to allow the sheriff to glide at the perfect angle, with the perfect speed. Barry's back hit the wood floor as on the other occasions, muscles expertly set to distribute and mostly nullify the impact. For the sheriff, the path was more complex. He landed heavily in the spittoon, which emitted a gelatinous clang and began to slide across the length of the den. At the same time, the vile fluid therein, displaced by the impact, flew up in a giant glob, a glob that stayed perfectly parallel to the bucket on its aerial trajectory. The path went exactly between gaming tables, until it ended at the far wall. The spittoon clanged to a stop, and the horrible glob hit the wall above it, then slid right back down, to where the sheriff had begun to struggle and writhe, with a sickening thwop. A taxidermized trout on the wall above was knocked loose. It plopped down to swim beside him. He looked at it forlornly, a big fish-like frown on his lips. Several spectators fainted from excitement. And the crowd was still screaming. After forming a group to lock the sheriff and his deputy in their own cells, and giving the key to the newly reformed town drunk, Barry was more than sure it was time to turn in. He assured the fine Ifsaga ladies of the establishment he didn't need any services, not even complimentary ones, though he said that if he did, he would make a point of paying an honest price for honest work, and after sticking a bit of mushroom powder between his gums and having a tinkle, he went straight to bed. The dreaming started without delay. He was back walking the T-town paths. A heavy fog covered everything. He made his way towards the light in the distance. That light was watching him. It was up there, in the corner. Mischievous, malevolent? More than mischief, it wasn't malice in the way we think of it. The path led into a ravine. The fog deepened, a dark gray that flowed in a tide all around. Barry continued, walk unaware. Then, a step. And a sound. Another step. Another sound. The sound was harsh. But Barry doesn't care about that. So you can see another step, and harsher, step and step, soon it was grating like sandpaper on his bones. This was the test. Barry took a step and the sound was like a screeching in the core of his self. He took a step and it was like a cheese grater on his marrow. He took a step and it was like dry ice in his veins. He took a step and the terror of the noise went beyond the nerves, it was in the cells. Like when you're a rabbit. And you hear the clank of the wolf fangs behind you. We are the reality and we will get you. There are no more steps for tonight. 5 Fungal findings. Room service. Barry turned stiffly towards the window. Dawn was flowing through the faded drapes. A sturdy woman dropped a tray of stale bread and water onto the room's small table, then left as abruptly as she'd come. Good. Just as instructed, they were barging in. Hopefully they'd get every room where wrestlers resided. In the clear light, he suddenly realized that the sheriff incident of last night had taken up so much of his time, he hadn't had an opportunity to probe for gossip. He was as ignorant of what was going on in the world as he had been. At least he'd gotten that bit about mushroom locations from the druggist. Mushroom hunting. It was something the rest of the group, which was now his group, would have no interest in. But what did motivate them? He knew the first part of his motivations. He was driven by a quest for knowledge. Were they really just driven by a muscular ego trip? This was a hard life, with little to show for it. They showed no contemplation, but he wasn't really satisfied. Was he reading too much into it? Or perhaps the boys were unknowingly chasing a ghost. Wrestler may have been their chosen occupation during the last time in their lives, long ago, when they were able to feel wonder. With no hope left, could some of them be chasing the spectral shadows of that wonder? He thought of some of the artists he'd met while pursuing his hobby of alchemical painting. Going into the field, these warriors of the doors of perception had developed promising ideas of their own. But many ideas are developed, few bear fruit worthy of the great halls of arts and letters. This he understood, which was why he never considered painting more seriously. To have a hope at greatness, he judged he would have to devote himself to the pursuit full time, thus jettisoning all his other promising avenues of learning. He could only feel admiration for those with the courage, nay the audacity, to try the hunt. But as the years ticked by and the flower of youth faded, these warriors would become disillusioned not by art, which remained as before, but by their own abilities. Their own avenues turned into creative dead ends. They saw talentless hacks elevated to master for a day by a lazy press. Friends and relatives of lesser understanding wondered what the value of their pursuit was, monetary or otherwise. As they looked on the merely near great works that now littered their living space and invaded their dreams, they began to reminisce on simpler times, longing for the tranquility of the more domesticated dreams that had preceded this mess. Their next painting was of a vase of flowers. It was instantly scooped up by some old aunt. They illustrated a friendly household cat, and acquaintances clamored for more. Soon they were occupied full-time. But it was an occupation that took long hours, didn't pay well, brought no savor to their lives. It would have been easier to get a degree in accounting and live a life no less ordinary, but much more comfy. Yet they couldn't. A misguided loyalty to the very dream they were betraying, kept them in the eternal cycle of domesticated, risk-free, and ultimately mediocre art production to fill the bathrooms of petty bourgeoisie with images of pugs and chrysanthemums. These boys probably saw through the romance of fighting years ago, even the youngest of them. But what else would they do? For some, the process of disillusionment is a nightmare. Better to preserve the dream. But when even dreams have fled, the chance to be near their residue may be life's only enticement. Who is more fanatically dedicated than one for whom the source of dedication has lost all savor but who feels the desperate need for that old charm, and can see no other recourse? Like hungry ghosts, they cling to their former nourishment and are never satisfied. This is what is meant by fandom. To go on after disillusionment, in a misplaced dedication to a former momentary glory, that now only serves to sully that glory further and further. This is what is meant by politics. A cock crowed. The boys would be waiting. And he was now their leader. Mushrooms alive, he hoped that the kind of fungus he was aiming for could be found in the dank woods. And he hoped it would respond the way he deduced it would. The smell of damp leaves hit the nostrils as soon as the tree-line border was breached. This was an unyielding part of the journey. The woods might not have been as treacherous as the desert, on the face of it. But there were almost no outposts. The swampland tribes had little clout in the world, and only modest traffic went between them and the plains. It was irritatingly hilly woodlands, and the road had to wind constantly to stay on level ground. A supply of burning aloes needed to be brought and burnt through the night to ward off mosquitoes, lest horrid diseases afflict the group. In the main cart, the flunkies and elders played Uno, while Barry whiled away the time reading philosophical documents. Tobias had been allowed to the front cart, trading places with the most junior of the lackeys, who was told he got to be in charge of cart number 2. This allowed the boys to see Barry and Tobias tag team solidarity. The pair had settled on the name Dynamic Duo until something better could be thought up. Lunch breaks were brief. The group was never that anxious to stay around the dismal brown landscape. The worms, weevils and other less mentionables that hid under the leaves would squish out at every footfall. The trees loomed stodgy and umber in the dim light. There was little evidence of animal life around, but the boys had to check for ticks after every exiting of the wagon. Every mealtime, Barry would run off like a flash to who knew where, always popping back right on time. While he was away, any feedback was given to his lackeys, who related on his return. But no one had anything to say, really. It was a long, boring, necessary part of the trek. But not so boring for Barry. His corner of the head wagon had become a small alchemical workshop, with the whole mortar pestle alembic setup common to amateur alchemists, but also many measures, graters, and sieves. He spent much of his time wiping his equipment down. Other times he filtered what looked like dirt around into different measurements. It looked as boring as anything could get. Little could anyone know Barry was going in for the kill. And it would take just one rare mushroom sighting to pull the trigger. The middle of the second week. Barry was slightly disturbed that the boys weren't more impatient. But according to the charts and flunkies' readings, they wouldn't be in these miserable dank woods for much longer. And if he estimated correctly, they shouldn't be too far from his best bet for a mushroom finding range. He was keeping a constant eye out the window these days, looking for the telltale signs. Soon now, very soon. Jeepers! It was the Rainsboy, who always made the first sightings. Up ahead. The forest is well, it slobbered, I guess. Yuh. Everyone stuck their heads out of the sides of the front car and looked ahead. Soon all the other wagons were following suit. What they saw was peculiar and more. 4 yards around, the terrain a relatively flat stretch in that ever-hilly region was near deforested. But the prominent trunks were not neatly hewn near the base. Instead, the ragged, jagged bases had an abundance of green ooze on them, as if masticated on by some gelatinous behemoth. But no behemoth was visible in the area. What was around, standing in the middle of the road at the center of the cleared area, was 3 massive, hirsute humanoids. Barry recognized the uniforms immediately. Exactly like the one on the deputy. They had their arms crossed. With no visible mode of conveyance anywhere near, it was not clear how they had gotten there. But it was clear they had no intention of moving. Barry waved his hand to the Rainsboy. The front carriage stopped, then all the others. Barry was the first to step out, followed by Tobias, then Flunky. The 3 walked forward. Soon, everyone was out of the cars and watching the 3-on-3 confrontation about to unfold. These were the same kinds of creatures, all right, with the same fingernail talons and noxious odor. But these were around 8 feet tall, with no reduction in muscle density. And, Barry reflected, they might have stank more. How did this gunk get here? Barry asked without ceremony. The central deputoid spat. Barry saw his answer. It was a bioluminescent green ooze puddle. The assholes ate the trees. And how did you clowns get here? We got some nerve, said the left deputoid in a surprisingly human-sounding rasp. This our jurisdiction round as parts. Bo y'all better get hh. For I get ya fors ya. All three creatures clanked their fingernail claws in unison, swaying about in a hammy attempt at intimidation. Listen, Barry said to his companions at a volume that couldn't be overheard. We can't let the other wrestlers get involved in this. We could have no able-bodied fighters left by the time we make the first destination. Normally I would say this is good practice, but those claws could be poisoned. Get out your pocket knives and give them a nuclear manicure first, then wrestler the way home. Got it? All three pulled out their pocket knives. They got steadily weapons. The beastmen flew into a frenzy at the sight of the small blades, bursting into green slobbering attacks. Flunky, a nimble tactician, had two longish pocket knives with which to fence the fingernails of his foe. Tobias used small scissors combined with short tactical pulls. Keeping 3 steps ahead, Barry was finished in no time. He simply filed the central deputoid's nails at light speed. The creature looked down at its well-manicured hands in confusion. Then its life erupted into chaos. Barry grabbed it by the leg and spun. Tobias had his quarry in an arm lock. He held him in place as Barry spun his around, making their heads smack into one another with an ugly crack. Flunky was getting his set up. Barry passed him up the first round, then his and Tobias smacked heads again, more sickening than before. The second round, Tobias got his up, and the smack sent them down with concussions. Barry looked in sickness at what had been wrought. It was clear that these imbeciles would survive just fine, or at least, kinda sorta clear. But what manner of permanent brain damage had he inflicted on the already stupid brutes? Would the violence never end? Could they not be educated, be made full members of the community? Did they always have to be bad cops? What was a bad cop, at the end of the day, if not a worse criminal? Did that work? Not really. Come on, he said, I'm getting sick just being here. He began to turn around, then held up his hand. There it was. Atop a small mound between two big greenwood stumps, sat the key to paradise. He stepped towards it, on consecrated ground, enwrapped. It was thin, windy, purpurate, with a tip like a pig's snout. The hell of it was actually lichen. How did it work? It wasn't clear, but you couldn't argue with the results of nature. He knelt, switching his pocket knife to ultra scalpel. With his left hand, he grabbed a plastic baggie from his pocket, gloved it. Then, with the demeanor and precision of one who was performing both brain surgery and a sacred ceremony simultaneously, he bagged that sucker. Boys, don't argue with me. I want you to take those unconscious hairy bastards back to the wagons and restrain them, no buts. I'm going into the main car, and I'll be out shortly. Be patient. He rushed into the main car, closely followed by Flunky and Tobias, as the boys struggled with the bulk of the deputoids, hastily dividing themselves into teams. My dear Barry, Tobias said, this behavior is highly unconventional. Unconventional, Tob, yes, and requiring complete concentration. Flunky, stay at the door and relay anything important to me. Tobias, if you'd be so kind as to hold this alembic for one moment. Barry took a small piece of the strange new lichen from its base, gave it the old mortar and pestle treatment. Then he worked frenziedly, almost too fast to follow. Soon he had an eyedropper full of purple sludge. Tob, please grab that medikit over there. I stake my professional reputation on what happens next. He was out in a flash. The deputoids lay flat on their backs. Space. Tobias, Flunky, ice pack these clowns, yes, you heard right, and tend to their wounds. You men, if anything happens, let us bear the brunt of it, and come in and overpower them after. I don't want a word of complaint. See to it that they're as well tended as if it was one of ours who got those knocks. Kneeling over the first, Barry squirted a drop of the violet stuff into each polluted nostril. Then he gave it a light slap on both cheeks, repeating the process for the next two. Finally, to the wonderment of all witnessing, he stood up and waited. Tense moments passed as Tobias rubbed ointment behind the being's ears, and Flunky patted their foreheads with an ice pack. Then, they began to awaken. But a miracle was happening. In the place of volatile barbarity, their eyes now showed the light of reason. "Where are we?" asked the central one, looking around groggily. "All of life has been a dream. A fog has been lifted, and with it a horrible weight. I can recall everything." The being's eyes welled with tears. It turned towards Barry, one hand outstretched, causing momentary tension in the ranks. "I believe we have you to thank, kind benefactor. We have been without the light of reason, I now see. But this was not how we were made. This was not the role we were intended to fulfill in this vicious circle. Our minds were open, but they were made to be shut. Can you tell us, dear friend," said Barry, "who or what agency it was that brought about this atrocity? Would that I could. It would be but small recompense. I know that whatever agency it was, will not look kindly on your magical fluid. A stuff such as that, itcher of 1,000 worlds, nectar of limitless ambrosia, ambrosia of 1,000,000 worlds, itcher of one nectar, such a mind substance will never be welcome to its beasts. But when we taste it? Ah! I don't know how long I can be allowed to live like this. But I plan to enjoy every day and every minute left to me in the light. I know in this, I speak for my allies as well. Maybe this can help you. I remember being told on more than one occasion, to keep working, and make sure that everyone in my jurisdiction kept busy. But often they were senseless tasks. My employers, the few sheriffs of Dankwood's jurisdictions, were just mediocre, not high-level stuff at all. But they repeated something that sounded like it came from another level above them, and they were parroting it. They would say, "We gotta keep 'em working. Because if you stop work, you have time to think. When you're working, you're not thinking." You can see by that, what kind of work these taskmasters had us dealing with. Friend, you deserve rest. We will take you a ways in our conveyance if you'd like. I would, but it's not possible. Not possible. It's not ever, ever possible to repay you dash. I won't hear any more of it. I'm a man of learning, pursuing knowledge as a matter of course. It was nothing. But if you think it wisest not to join us even briefly, and I very much trust your judgment on this, then you must be about ready to disperse from the area. We won't trouble you further. If we meet again, perhaps next time, we can speak longer. Farewell, comrade." That night, the dreams. It was another footfall hall. This time it was nearly pitch black. It was like a great ancient sewer tunnel filled with masonry rubble, with puddles and groundwater all over, and bars and grates above, up in the high walls. From one of these grates, the imp. It froze his bones. He stepped forward rapidly, stepping, 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 and stepping. No noise. Then, noise. Then noise, then noise, then noise, then noise, then noise, then noise, then a really unbearable noise, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then, and then. He couldn't do it. He couldn't. He couldn't do it. He couldn't. He couldn't do it. He couldn't. He decided to go ahead and take another more steps. And noise. 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 And noise, and he felt broke in. And he couldn't. So he decided to take another step. He took a step and the terror of the noise went beyond the nerves, it was in the cells. Like when you're a rabbit. And you hear the clank of the wolf fangs behind you. We are the reality and we will get you. There are no more steps for tonight. 6 Mud bugging out. What was left behind? Why was it left behind? And what does that tell us about what wasn't? These were the things on Barry's mind as the caravan left the dank woods at long last, entering more honest swamp country that was dotted with live oaks draped in Spanish moss. This was the exotic deep swamp region, and now it wouldn't be too long before they breached the territory of the Gator tribes, wrestling fanatics who would surely offer an education in pugilism. When the path crossed land that was submerged under dark swamp water, it would rise up on cypress walkways of amazing sturdiness. At these times the risk of ambush was real, since one carriage could just barely fit through. However, the risk of structural collapse seemed to be nil, and at the rate the speed mules were going, it would have taken a really expert team to pull an ambush off. If there were any such finks lurking in the dark branches above, they wisely chose not to push their luck with this particular wagon train. The deputoids had been enlisted, at some point, as the arm of the oppressors of small, out-of-the-way communities. At least, some of them had. Where did they come from? Could they have been a tribe of mutants, manipulated by lack of resources and some opportunistic encroacher? There were surely any number of unrecorded mutated tribes since the end of the time of the hungry ghosts had heralded a sudden acceleration in human mutation. At that time, records indicated, the iron grips of technology and social programming had begun to relax on a jaded and exhausted human populace, though it was unclear what factors had brought about this shift. Barry contemplated the dark ages, the hungry ages, countless souls hiding in their folds like children hiding in the skirts of a cyclopean matron. What savage age might have spawned such a hairy deputoidal clan, from among the many centuries between the close of the Hungry Ghost era and the time of transition that was now unfolding? There were too many unknown and barely known corners of the nation, too many savage eras, to even begin to guess at it. The deputoids were deputized. Barry thought back to the sheriff, the last time, he hoped, he'd have to think about him. Who pulled the strings of the puppeteers? Where did it stop? Next time, he would not be distracted. He had to question the saloon crowd. The dog faces were having problems with the sheriff. Was this just the case in that one small outpost, or was it systematic? How much of a connected network was there between law enforcement across the United States? This was not the last the T-Town caravan, a rather disreputable seeming lot, would be seeing of local law. If he was to guide everyone through the potentially continuous challenges set up by crooked cops, he would need more information. The next officer anyone suplexed could set off a nationwide dragnet. But let them get their way once, and the whole T-Town team would be marked as juicy suckers. They would be beset by phony charges at every stop. This was a scourge. Before thinking about a cure, as he was naturally inclined to, Barry had to focus on navigating the minefield. For the sake of the boys, and for the sake of his hallowed mission. He now had to meet Jazzy Jayhawk more than ever, to pick his brain and see how much he already knew, as much as to learn new things from him. The renowned MDR couldn't possibly have missed the potential in these mycological developments. What was he still researching and what might he be keeping back? The exit from the damp and crowded forest, with its unceasingly dull scenery, was a relief, but the air of the authentic swamplands was scarcely less oppressive, at least not at this time of year. As the wagon train traveled farther south, the climate became, not hotter, but wetter, like being slowly steamed alive. In spite of the discomfort, the perspiration this miasmal region brought about actually caused a natural, healthful exfoliation of the skin, and Barry didn't wonder that there were tales of ancient elders among the Gator tribes that had lived so long, nobody knew what era they were born in. Then, the expected sighting. A short way off the path was a capacious picnic area dotted with wooden tables. Mighty-looking men were gathered there, by the look of it, engaged in frolicsome activities like arm wrestling and speed eating contests. Curiously, no women seemed to be around. Barry wondered if their societal roles kept them in more domestic settings, or if this was just the makeup of this particular group. The T-Town boys knew little of their southern counterparts. The wagons moved into a parking formation on the roadside. It was time to meet the neighbors. The picnic area looked out onto true submerged marshland, green with algae and dotted with small islands of palm trees and explosive foliage. Cranes and other marsh birds cavorted on land and air. The T-Town boys, with Barry at their head trailed closely by Tobias and Flunky, strode boldly into the area, breathing deep and stretching their muscles with gusto. So absorbed were the bayou dwellers in their frolics, they only noticed the visitors when they were practically among them. The calm of the tribesmen was palpable. These were tough customers. The leader turned. There was no confusing this fellow with his lackeys. Tall and swarthy, of deeply southern physiognomy, his wide musculature was of a different order from that of lesser men, being tremendously toned, yet without a trace of stiffness, a mark of distinction it's impossible to duplicate through illusion. All his movements were like the cool, inevitable shiftings of a synchronized horde of pythons. His clothing was ragged swamp get-up, only slightly less dull-hued than the rest, and his hair was worn in the same long, lank strands as the others. His age was impossible to determine. Some Gator tribesmen were rumored to be hundreds of years old, yet have the appearance of a man of 50 and the strength of a strong man of 30. Apart from his size and general aura, the thing that immediately set him apart was his headdress. Under his sturdy square chin ran the strap which affixed to his cranium the massive taxidermized upper half of a huge alligator. The scaly skin was in a state of perfect preservation. The beady eyes, now eternally open, glinted as they might have in life. The man got languidly to his feet, having recently completed an arm wrestling conquest. "Well, what we gots here, H?" He appraised Barry with a gaze that was transcendently level. "Salutations, fellows," said Barry. "We're a wrestling troupe, just passing through your lovely area. You lot wouldn't happen to know of any strong fighters around about these parts? We'd be obliged to you." Barry returned the gaze with utter serenity. "Ah boy, you don no mook chs1 bid bout te folk raund these perts, t-plane. We hbh at will rasslin." The chieftain laughed a low, sardonic laugh. "We hbh at will rasslin." He snapped his fingers at the general body of his group. "Giht some refreshment for th guests h. And I wagers, ya been on th road as 2h law." He squinted slightly. A fellow brought over the receptacle of the refreshment in question, a massive ceramic vessel which he had to hoist on his shoulder. It was filled with fragrant mint lemonade. Bisected lemons and still green spearmint leaves floated about in the concoction, which, judging by odor and color, was clearly freshly made. The offering was proffered to Barry, who, as the leader, was clearly expected to imbibe first. The chieftain looked on, poker-faced. Barry took up the heavy vessel effortlessly, taking an appreciative whiff. He took a slight sip. And paused. The euphoria was totally unexpected. He brought the heavy vessel to his lips for another sip, and then a third. The second brought no increase of euphoria, and the third, rather less than before. It was plain that, fine though this fresh squeezed nectar was, its quality couldn't account for a tenth part of the feeling. He probed. Did the flavor, the odor, the circumstances remind him of something? Surely it could only be recollection that accounted for the pleasure level. He probed his mind, probed his memories. He took a fourth sip, simply to keep the drink on his palate. Now he felt the resistance. In the mind, there's a mediocrity placed by nature as a gatekeeper. Think only of the present and the immediate future, the sentinel seems to say, that is easy, that comes natural. And the intrepid mind is forced to turn to the sentinel, and report, yes, perhaps staying on the matters of the immediate comes natural, but it was never by taking the easy route, by simply sticking to well-paved roads, that anything of significance was accomplished. So then let me through, friend gatekeeper, for I have loftier ambitions. I must chart the territory of memory. And no sooner are these lofty ambitions proclaimed, than the gate seems to shrink into the distance, unbreached, elusive still. As Barry took a fifth sip, the chieftain stepped forward and upended the entire vessel and contents over Barry's head. In the darkness of the vessel, with the uproarious laughter of the gator tribesmen echoing strangely in the enclosed ceramic chamber, Barry lost track briefly of the course of his thoughts. And then the vision came to him. The memory was behind no gate. Rather it was a sunken ship, a heavy dreadnought with iron anchor as massive and weighty as Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, buried to half its length within the sands of the midnight depths. No light penetrated to shine on its rusting hull. The sea creatures which housed within it were not of normal wholesome make, like those familiar to most mariners. But a shaft of light, from some incalculable source, had now glinted off it, for however brief a moment. And now the anchor shuddered. It rumbled. With abyssal creakings, the ship began unmooring itself from the sand which had held it willing prisoner for millennia. With a potent sense of pressure released, the anchor blasted free at last in a massive cloud of seas tough. And in the timeless time of that vision, the vessel rose through illimitable gulfs of a space beyond conception, crossing regions inconceivable, regions undreamed of. And then memory returned. A coffee house. A cup of grande mint lemonade. And Morgo, across the table. It was one of the few times Barry shared a walk with anyone. They got up with their cups, tiring of the stuffy ambience, and headed back out. The shop was near the summit of a mountainous hike. They set out, and soon came upon an altitudinous meadow. Clumps of tufts of rushes were situated between crisscrossing networks of gentle mountain brooks. The crisp blue air had the electric spark of magic. Now this was clean living. Barry helped Morgo keep her footing as they crossed one brook after another, soon losing track of where they had come from. And then the terrain began to rise ever so slightly, and they were making for a ridge. They surmounted it, after just a little climbing. And on the other side, a vast valley. It stretched nearly the distance of sight, but massive mountains closed it in on all sides. It dipped low enough to have forests of small trees here and there, but to climb down the ridge would be no great ordeal. To reach the other side, might take days. Barry turned. There was no sign of Morgo. There had never been. In sudden panic, he looked down and realized that the brooks and rushes had long ago eliminated any trace of a path. He desperately scanned the horizon for any sign of the coffee shop, but it must have been hidden behind something of which he could find no great candidates. His sense of direction was thoroughly tangled. He bounded down the ridge, across the clump islands, hoping against hope that he could feel out his path. Dark clouds were now gathering, threatening rain, a rain that could make the lower crossings impassable for days, and flood the entire region. Was this the price of freedom? Was this the price of freedom? The Barry of the present moved his arms sideways, and the ceramic vessel entrapping them shattered in an explosion of pottery shards. In an instant, the chieftain was behind him, putting him in an unbreakable armlock. His gator tribesmen cheered wildly, and the T-Town boys stepped back, unsure of their new leader. The chieftain moved Barry about with ease, walking him over to a picnic table. He leaned casually against the side, Barry still firmly in his armlock. "What all, and Mackie can do h fay ysel, chili," he smugly proclaimed. To the Town boys' astonishment and the gator tribesmen's further amusement, Barry's face remained utterly calm and totally impassive. He had bounded back towards what he had hoped was the trail, still not seeing the coffee shop. Those years ago, he had done something in panic, that he had then forgotten about, until now. Saints be praised. Of course. He had rashly used his alchemical understanding of the human ligaments and musculature. And in that time, to speed up his crossing of the brooks and his movement over clumpy terrain, he had greatly stretched his limbs. When he finally caught sight of the coffee shop, it was closed due to weather and the employees had long run down the mountain. His stretchy bound had taken him into their midst before they could even reach the bottom. The rain turned out to not be as bad as predicted, but it had been a valuable lesson, on any number of levels. Now, he called upon that ability, gained in the heat of necessity. But this time, it was augmented by subsequent years of alchemical research and practice. The chieftain still leaned smugly, sometimes waving him slightly to either side like a banner, bringing a new chorus of cheers and laughter from the tribesmen. His arms were in a firm, nigh unbreakable lock. But his hands and wrists, sensibly judged useless in their current position, stuck free. Now he began the drastic elongation of said wrists. And they began, unnoticed by all at first, out of immediate line of sight, to snake about like rapid-growing vines of flesh. They crept up the chieftain's back, careful not to touch it yet and so give their position away. A hand snaked around to the big gator helmet. Deftly, a forefinger reached out and closed each eyelid. The chieftain's face darkened for a moment. A feeling struck him, though he didn't know from where. The hand snaked down and, with a smack like a dangerous ant about to put the death grip on some tyke's cheeks, it planted itself palm down on the chieftain's face. He went cross-eyed. In a moment, the chieftain was completely enwrapped by Barry's elastic limbs. "Ha ha, Barry go ohhh," he exclaimed. "Now strike." But it did nothing to sour his apparent victory. The limbs wrapped snugly enough, but they had no purchase in any part that could amount to anything really dangerous by itself. And the chieftain's grip was uncompromised. He had the interloper to their picnic in as secure a vice as he had had him in the beginning, and in the middle, and he saw no sign that it should loosen any time soon, if he, the boss around these here parts, didn't want it to. Barry extended his limbs further near the base of the grip. This time, he wasn't adding to the chieftain's enwrapping. He was just giving himself more slack. And then, the unguissable. With little sign of effort, Barry shifted the gator tribal elder from his position of leverage on the table, got him into a more open area and, still with his back turned, began to lift the massive fellow into the air. It was like watching the man being hoisted aloft by some unhallowed fleshy-colored two-tendrilled squid. Barry's visage showed concentration, not strain, as he hoisted the now yelling warrior further aloft yet. The chieftain's hands scrabbled to regain his grip, but he was being lifted too quickly. Stretchy limbs waved about under the bulk of the mighty load, yet succeeded to raise it further without compromising one iota the tightness of their constraint. Whhhoa. Thits dong get trick. Whhhoa, came the chieftain's hoarse yells. He was quickly abandoning all pretense of composure. From the men on both sides, there was much shouting and bewildered yammering. And then, as Barry at last hoisted the chieftain, with a visible quivering of the limbs but with no reduction in grip, to the height at which his feet were clean above everyone's heads, the two sides now somewhat intermingled began to cheer. The festivities continued into early evening. Barry was damp. He ached. He smelled like lemon. But the two groups immediately got along like a house on fire, and he wouldn't retire to the wagon and risk seeming ungracious. The gator tribesmen were a wealth of info. Yes, the women were caring for the children and keeping the hearths warm. The men were supposed to be gathering food, but the harvest of the bayou was plentiful this season, and hunting was just their excuse to be out and about. The major town of the area, they told the group, was Neuzo, a crow-infested fortress of decadence. Dark words were spoken of the ultra-flabby inhabitants and their surprisingly dexterous licentiousness. Apparently, so great, so ingeniously devised were the fleshly depravities and sensual distortions told of in tales of their carnal cavortings, that the mere thought of the citizenry inspired the gator tribes people, themselves not at all prudish, with a species of superstitious dread. Darker, more outwardly harmful doings were whispered at as well. But it was acknowledged that, for putting on shows of physical prowess, one could find no more receptive audience than in that far-flung city on the edge of the great bayou that leads to the swampy seas. Often, young, strong Gator tribesmen would go there to gain riches in this way, though the older group members hated to think what effect the place might have on the moral fiber of their youth. Impatiently changing the subject, the Gator tribesmen were most anxious for their guests to sample some of their famous cuisine. The parochial T-Town boys immediately shied away on seeing it. The aroma was by turns noxious and appetizing, sometimes in the same breath. Near to the scummy water, a titanic soot-blackened cauldron had been placed. A raging fire warped the swamp air below it. Plumes of black clouds redolent of spices wafted heavenward. The pot was filled near to the brim with what looked like dark green mud, tinted with seasonings to a Hadean reddish ochre. The sludgy broth bubbled noisomely and noisily. At frequent intervals, an unspeakably uncouth shape would bob to the surface, before quickly diving back, subsumed again by its habitat. Barry recognized it immediately. This was the famous boiling of the mud insects, the centerpiece of Gator tribe cuisine. Without hesitating, he thrust his whole hand into the hot stew and fished around. After a moment, he pulled it out and, turning, presented his bounty to his boys. The Gator tribesmen chuckled, as noiselessly as they could, at the bug-eyed horror on the faces of the foreigners. What Barry held in his willing palm was a mound of eldritch insectal horrors, the likes of which no wholesome world could ever allow to exist. The unkempt chaos of spines, pincers, bulbous stingers, jagged appendages, and things less defined and less definable, sat loathsome in an oily black pyramid of outer anarchy. T-Town lips quivered. T-Town eyes watered. What horrid curse, what foul bog sorcery had befuddled their champion? What? Look, you morons, declaimed Barry, trying to maintain composure. You don't eat the outside. You break them open. Like this. He took one of the small nightmares from the pile with his other hand. Deftly, he cracked open the unwholesomely shiny dark red carapace, causing a puff of gray vapor and a squelchy snapping sound that stood the hair on end. Then he widened the aperture, revealing the most appetizing cutlet of seafood that could be imagined. White and flaky, with overtones of prawn and Gulf redfish, the seasonings brought the fresh surf meat to peak flavor. Barry sniffed the aroma with connoisseurly appreciation, then, putting his mouth right up to the horror, he sucked, not only the meat, but all the brain juices and other assorted ochre guts, which had taken even more of the seasoning's piquant flavors, right out of the aperture, which his lips just barely touched. Several T-Town boys fainted. The Gator tribesmen slapped their knees with the effort of held-back laughter. Delicious, Barry exclaimed, closing his eyes in a genuine culinary ecstasy. Back at the tables, Tobias was distinguishing himself at arm wrestling, deemed by knowledgeable parties to be nearly as powerful as the chieftain. Flunky was doing quite well for himself at the game of knuckle bones. But the day was wearing on, and the Gator tribesmen had to get back to their families, the wrestlers to their journey. It has been a true pleasure making you fellows' acquaintance, Barry said with genuine feeling. Yeah, said the chief, and you bohs jes come back and say hi sanitime ans we shi ya agud stu and agud h tom. As the boys filtered back into their respective cars, it was plain that their spirits were refreshed after the dreary forest days. The change to scenic bayous would likely keep the state up. But Barry knew the challenge hadn't even begun. In drafting the itinerary, Torval had put red checkmarks around a handful of areas he thought would be especially hazardous to both the physical and moral health of the team. One of these few checks was on Neozo, Raven's haunt, city of dirty birds. And at the accelerating rate the modified speed mules were going, although they'd been fed no more fungus powder even with this lengthy stop, they should be arriving at the gates within 2 days.